Welcome back. I'm sitting with Elise Bishop and Toni Kendell talking about their career in recording and making music. Just before we're talking about the differences between Australia and New Zealand in terms of the music making and music recording, I'd like to know a little bit more about that. How big is the music business here in New Zealand compared to Australia?
Well, when I was around the New Zealand music business, it was much smaller than in Australia, but it seems to have expanded in the last 10 years as well.
Well, the kind of music industry that we were interested in is a bit different than the perceived commercial business.
I mean, 90% of music that is made is not top 40 major label music, and I think that's probably becoming more and more apparent to people. I think that's always been the case, but for a while it appeared as if the major music labels were the music industry. I mean, that's all that got played on the radio, all that got seen on the TV, yet the whole time that was happening there was a music industry beneath that was vital and active and informed that top 40 stuff. And yeah, I guess the music industry as it was perceived couldn't have existed without all the grassroots stuff as well.
And the grassroots stuff here in New Zealand, how's it organised? How's that visible? Where do people go to play music here in New Zealand?
Well, most towns have venues.
Yep.
And I guess there's a lot of talk at the moment because Flying Nuns turned 30. So all those Flying Nun bands in New Zealand were, I guess, groundbreakers.
No, well, they were a really good inspiration, weren't they? I mean, they'd just go down, play a gig, someone might record it and like tour. They just kind of did it off the cuff. They weren't looking for any kind of recognition or fame or anything like that. They were just doing it for the love. It was a bit of a punk ethic.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we come from. Our recording and our playing is just...
Yeah, which is part of wider New Zealand culture as well, that, you know, number 8 wire, do it yourself, make the most of what you've got kind of attitude. And that fed into the music scene really well. So I guess when I arrived on the New Zealand music scene, there was all the Flying Nun people, they were all still there, all those bands like Belt of Space and Straight Jacket Fits and Skeptics and Villains, all those bands were still there. Like, all the people in them were a bit older and they were mentors, I guess, for younger bands, and they helped support the scene. But New Zealand was predominantly about networking and about making friends, and if you had an interest in underground music, then you had a connection with someone in a different town who had an interest in underground music, and all those relationships were really well forged, and people moved around quite a lot and supported each other.
And in Melbourne, what would you say about Melbourne?
More disparate. You don't get to meet everyone. There's still that scene thing happening though, where networking is really important and bands look after each other.
But there's a bit more strive there than maybe the New Zealand scene was.
Yeah, the potential to achieve radio airplay and some sort of monetary recognition is there in Australia, so that's a goal for some people, whereas it wasn't in New Zealand in the 90s.
Don't know what it's like in New Zealand now. We've been living over on Great Barrier Island, quite isolated.
But I get the perception that 90s music scene has fed what's happening now. You know, I'm hearing a lot of stuff on Radio National that's pop-based, you know, that comes from that 90s New Zealand sound.
Now, the Flying Nuns that you're referring to, what's the story of that?
Flying Nun was a label that started in Christchurch and moved to Dunedin in the 80s. So 30 years ago. And it got international recognition. So There was some recognition in New Zealand, right?
And it really helped foster that whole New Zealand sound. Like early Flying Nun was like this, I don't know, jingly jangly punk bass kind of sound.
But it had that bleakness about it, eh? Like
we're at the bottom of the world, kind of, woe is me, let's play music.
Like Blame, Blame, Blame song, There Is No Depression in New Zealand.
Yeah. Well, the Chills, Pink Frost, that's depressing.
And there was a whole lot of other political stuff going on in New Zealand too. Like there was stuff like the Springboks tour, and that was a catalyst for that political pop music that New Zealand was so good at making. And it influenced a lot of other stuff. So lately I've been hearing about Steve Malkmus's new album, and he was in a band called Pavement in the States, and they were heavily influenced by New Zealand music. So yeah.
Well, even when I first got to Melbourne, people would say, "Are you from Dunedin? Do you know the Clean?" Like the New Zealand scene, the early Flying Nun scene was popular.
Yeah. Well, and I remember when I went to high school and I finished in '88 in Australia, and then I moved back to New Zealand, and I remember one of my school friends, because I was, sort of maybe lamenting leaving Australia at that point in time, and my school friend said, "Oh no, there's really good bands in New Zealand. There's a band called The Clean and there's a band called Straight Jacket Fits." and so I came over to gold in New Zealand.
You said before that music back in the 90s was more political. Do you think it still is? What's music about these days?
For me, it's always been political. And I know, like, I've been bands with people who deny that it has a political element, but I've always felt really strongly that my music is political, and it's railing against mass production and the major label music scene, and it's challenging for people. I'd say music's still political for lots of people.
Do you think that's what appeals to music listeners, their political message, or the fact that the performers are political?
No, everyone's a music listener, aren't they? And most people are anyway.
Yeah.
But they don't all like politics to come into their music.
I think because our music could be seen as affronting in a way, because it's very loud and it's quite noisy and
talks about anti-war things.
Anti-war, lots of things. But we really like it.
Well, it's that enthusiasm. You've got to like your own music for people to like it. I think we might just take a commercial break here to answer the phone.
Sure.
Come back in a moment with the rest of it.